Welcome. Welcome. You are watching the Game Audio Hour number 94. This is the weekly podcast where we discuss all things game audio. I'm not actually reading from down here, and you can see my eyes kind of dropping down. I'm actually looking at the camera, but you don't know that. From creative ideas to the latest techniques, project experiences to audio secrets, here is where you'll find in-depth coverage and opinions related to game audio. And sadly today we are missing our magnanimous, gregarious, superfluous, no, not superfluous, leader, Mr. Carl Johnson, who's actually away on a trip, I believe. But instead of to fill in the huge shoes left by Kyle's charming presence, I have brought with me two friends. Let's have a look here. We have Michael Shapiro. How are you today?
I'm doing well, but I have to say I'm a little unnerved by the floating, severed Hello Kitty head in the background of your video feed. What's the story behind that?
I have no idea what you're talking about.
Oh, Jesus!
Yeah, no, actually, my kids went to I won't show you the back because that would be product placement, but my kids went to some event in the city, and so now we have these. I've actually got another one over here who's just sort of sitting here in standby in case something happens to this guy. So they're all over the house now.
Well, maybe if Ozone ceases to be our advertiser, we can talk to Daiwa House and show them. We've already given them some good promotional exposure on the show.
Right. Yeah, that's right. Did you see nicely how just a moment ago this one kind of like slowly crept into the shot? Isn't that that's nice. Well planned, isn't it? Speaking of slowly creeping into the sorry, what?
Very Kubrick-esque.
And speaking of Kubrick, Vince, is this how Kyle does his segues? Is this am I kind of on the right track here?
I think you are. It's kind of scary, kind of unnerving. I'm not sure if I could handle two guys doing those types of segues in and out of all the things that are happening on the show. So I'm doing all right. I'm glad to be here on the show again, and yeah, those Hello Kitty heads are pretty crazy. You should have more of them. I think that would be really, really fun.
Yeah, well, it works for a 1-year-old and a 6-year-old. I don't know that it works for the rest of us. Anyway, let's get into it. So, if you're watching the show on YouTube or if you're watching the show on our site, welcome to our marvelous audience in the chat room, and let's get into today's topics. So we have two sort of juicy topics. One a bit longer than the other, so I think we'll drop into the shorter one first, because the second one is probably going to go on a bit. So today, Vince was just mentioning in the chat room that we have where we convene before the broadcast about the Korg M1, and we were sort of discussing the merits of vintage hardware from the era of synthesizers when it was all digital. And I have a question for you, Vince, which you might be able to answer, or Mike as well. If I really like the sound of a vintage digital synthesizer, so say, for example, the Korg M1 or the Wave Station or the DX7, is getting one of the many fantastic plugins that actually emulate these digital synthesizers arguably a better option than forking out what is, not that much money these days for one of the authentic real things, massive, big, heavy chunk of a synthesizer to plop down in front of your desk. Do you really gain that much from having an authentic, like a real Korg M1 or a real DX7, when a lot of the times the synthesizers from those eras being, digital, you have this tiny little 2-line LCD display to do all of your programming on, whereas on these very nice-sounding plugins these days, you have a whole full screen full of stuff to click, and it's all much more easier. And you've got, easy patch recall. You don't have to go out and try and find 3.5-inch floppy disks to save your patches on, or cartridges or whatever they used. Do you really gain that much by getting a real authentic piece from that era? What do you think, guys?
Yes, you gain a lot. You gain about 20 pounds, or about 8 kilograms or so. It is a hell of a lot that you're dealing with a Korg M1. But seriously, at least in the case of Korg and the M1, because I was looking at this specifically, and for some of you guys that don't know, the M1 was one of those one of those first in the whole world of romplers. So there was the Korg M1 and the Roland D series, and then
Mm.
everything else. That became the sound, or one of the many sounds that defined music going into the late '80s, early '90s. And it's a fine sound. There's lots of cool stuff on there. Um, and those things were really expensive. And now they're not so expensive, either on the used market or by getting plugins.
Mm.
And Korg makes some really wonderful plugins for these. For other instruments, let's say Roland and Emu, sometimes there will be other companies that actually make them. They'll actually create a library for it, for Contact or whatnot. Alesis, that's the case. Emu, that's the case. But for Korg and the M1, they decided to do their own homegrown plugins and other software. So you can get a VST M1. You can get the Korg I M1 for iOS. And it sounds 99.999% like the Korg M1. It sounds great. You can hook up a MIDI keyboard and it sounds great. I actually have it hooked up to my iPad at home because I'm using the IM1 for the iPad, and I've got a MIDI keyboard. I hook it up and it sounds great. But there are a couple of things that aren't quite there, and I found out about this, I guess, the hard way. There are some things that just don't quite respond the way that you expect them to. The factory patches are just fine, and if you wanted to program them, you could, but some things aren't quite right. So, for example, I'm an EB guy, and I use CC2. CC2 is the continuous controller for breath control. On both the VST as well as the iOS app, they don't like using CC2. It just does not work. And if I try to edit a patch in order to use CC2, actually that's not an option. And so I'm like, okay, what the heck do I do? Okay, I'm going to go into my patches, and instead of CC2, I'm going to be dealing with everything with Aftertouch, because those things respond to Aftertouch just the same way. Great. That's good. So I've got my IM1, and I think, oh man, this will actually be a lot easier if I just edit it in MIDI in SysX with Sonar. And it turns out that actually both the IM1 and the VST don't quite respond to SysX the same way between various DAWs. So if you're using Sonar, it responds to some things but not others. If you're using Digital Performer, it responds to some things but not others. It's not super reliable with SysX messages. So it's not quite perfect. If you want to really dive in there, if you actually want to take your old 3.5 discs worth of various patches that you made 20 years ago, assuming that the discs still work, you might want to check it out. It might not work without some serious editing on your part with the new permutations of digital software-only Korg M1.
Mm. It's interesting because arguably with these old synthesizers, like for example the Wave Station, which Korg also make as a plug-in version, and the classic, of course, the DX7, a lot of the time for myself, I find the only reason that I will be going to those synthesizers is because I want a certain classic patch. And there's a lot of those on the M1, and obviously even more of those on the DX7. And if you're wanting like a classic patch from one of these synthesizers, then buying the plugin gets you that immediately at 99.99% accuracy of what the real thing sounds like. Because the DX7 is notoriously difficult to program, and the M1 also, Wave Station as well. So actually buying these things as sound creation tools seems to me to be a little bit, I don't know, it's not for me anyway. I would get these things, well, I've got these things just because I really want that classic bell sound from the DX7, or that house piano from the M1 or whatever, right? So if that's your motive, do you think there's still any advantage in getting the hardware?
Man, yeah, I'm not sure. Uh, yeah, I'm just thinking there is a certain irony to that. You know, you've got the software, and that makes things easier, but you don't necessarily need to have that aspect be easier. You want the presets more than you want the sound capability. You know, even though they are still still capable.
Hmm.
Um, it's and I don't know. There's a part of me that thinks maybe I should just have that box sitting there because that box is going to be perhaps a little bit more reliable than even my DAW. I
Hmm.
mean, hey, you know, my DAW is not the most reliable thing in the world. My iPad is not the most reliable thing in the world. On the other hand, these hardware boxes, I'm pretty sure they crash rather less than those.
Hmm. How about you, Mike? What's your position on this?
Well, I'll give you my position, which I would describe as quasi-informed, as I don't actually own any emulation plugins of classic hardware synthesizers, or at least none that identify themselves as such. But I do have a number of old Romplers and hardware synths, and I've definitely spent some time in the trenches using them. And what I would suggest is, while you may not get a sonic benefit from actually physically having a JV 1080 or something, or Wave Station or something of that era, you may get a methodological benefit in that you will have a setup that's very different from the everything is accessible with slight inconvenience paradigm that we have today, and instead have a limited palette be extremely accessible in the sense that you've got a box dedicated to a certain palette of sounds and a very reliable way of selecting those sounds and kind of built-in limitations, but easy access.
Hmm.
And I think that there's a kind of interesting phenomenon that happens when you impose limitations on music and composition. If you limit yourself to an easily accessible palette, you might use it more often. You may not schizophrenically jump all the way across your vast library of sounds, but you might find yourself focusing on the palette of the hardware box. You might regard that as your kind of go-to inspirational retro jam palette. There might be some interesting impact on the way you compose music when you're using this particular sound. Whereas if you've got the Wave Station or JV or Proteus plugin in your DAW and it's kind of buried under a menu, sitting alongside any number of more modern synthesizer plugins, you might not even think to dig into that palette. You know, you may just have one fun jam session for the name of nostalgia, or if you're younger, to see how old people used to have to get by. But maybe the plugin will just be buried forever. Whereas if you're staring at that thing across your studio and there's this archaic MIDI cable draping across like an old like a laundry line or something, you might find yourself reaching for it more often out of convenience, and you might find yourself exploring its palette more often. And whether this is good or bad depends on you, but I'm always interested in the impact of limitations on the compositional procedure, and I think this is one interesting example of such limitations being imposed.
Wow, that is I can see you're just sort of laying the carpet for our next topic right there, Mike. I'm
I'm
resisting the
like,
temptation to dive right into it, but I'm going to go for it. Let's get right into it because I think the second topic is a lot of people are going to be interested in this. So, a little bit of background. My father is a classical musician. He plays pipe organ and concert piano and bits and pieces. And he recently bought me a really good book. I've got it right here. It's very thick. It's called The Rest is Noise by Alex Ross, Listening to the 20th Century. And this massive, thick book is it's an extremely well-written summary of 20th century music, right from the late Romantics, from Mahler and Strauss, all the way up to, apparently, according to my dad, at the end, quite a little bit about video game music at in the new millennium. And it's really, really interesting. So Alex Ross, I think he's actually a music journalist. So he writes this not like a music historian would write about music. He writes it like a journalist would, which means there's a sort of a sense of a little bit of a sense of storytelling in there. There's more of a sense of pacing and progression, and really kind of reads more like a story about what these different composers were going through, and the way that their thought process and their obviously their musical output was affecting society at the time. So Right now, I only started reading it a few days ago, so I've gone through Strauss and Mahler, and it mentions an opera by Strauss at I think it's just at the turn of the century. Mike might need to correct me on that. Called Salome, Salome, and apparently this was a very, very late Romantic work, but really, really stretching the boundaries of what people felt was tonally comfortable and harmonious to listen to. And apparently, when it was first released, it caused massive uproar because people simply weren't used to listening to something that was tonally so, well, progressive. When you listen to it now, if you go to YouTube and type in Strauss Salome, you will think, well, cool, sounds good, sounds like some modern movie soundtrack or something. Well, you need to, of course, remember that this is the first time that anything like this had been heard, and up until this point, there were very strict rules about tonality and what you can and can't do, and Strauss was really stretching things with that. And according to the book, at least, Salome was kind of one of the main catalysts which caused people to really stretch out and pull apart the idea of tonality and what it actually means for music to be harmonious and tonal. And right now, I've moved on to the amazing composer Schoenberg. And Schoenberg, of course, as we know, and his students Webern and Berg are the chief elder statesman of atonalism. So, just for people out there who may not be sort of too familiar with what atonalism means, let's turn to Mike for a brief, summarized description of atonalism.
Should have seen that coming. Talk about awkward segues. I believe the term most frequently used is atonality, though that's just how I've heard it. So when we're talking about atonality or atonalism, in the most generic sense, we just mean any departure, any systematic departure from the harmonic vocabulary that we're familiar with from the 18th and 19th century of Beethoven, Mozart, and Haydn. Anything that pushes meaningfully outside of that system, that doesn't have a 1 chord and then a 5 chord, arguably anything without a 5 chord is venturing into what we'd call atonality. So, Debussy, or things that we think of as music that we think of as consonant or maybe a little exotic, is still technically atonal. But usually when the term is used, it's referring to the flavors of atonality, this very systematic, very procedural, algorithmic compositional style approaches to atonality that tried to get away, as far as possible, away from the sense of being in a key. They didn't want a 1 chord, they didn't want a 5 chord, they wanted every note of the piano, of our scale, the chromatic scale, to be treated as a viable contender for what's next. So there's no sense of a chord progression, there's no sense of a home bass, and I think that's what we typically think of. That's what's suggested by atonality, even though technically the word is much broader in its meaning. So, as you were saying, Alex, the probably most famous proponent of a particular inflection of atonality is Arnold Schoenberg, who devised a system, I think in 1922, thereabouts, which we call the 12-tone serialistic system. And it was reducing music to a simple set of rules. And the idea was that, in his system, you would pick an ordering of the 12 notes of the chromatic scale, or the 12 notes in the piano, if you're a simpleton like me and want to think of it that way. So you're taking the 12 notes. I guess there's really 11, right? Because the 12th is just an octave duplication. But let's say 12, because I'm too lazy to check. Yeah.
It's definitely 12.
Yeah, okay, good. Glad you were there to check that for me. I see you've got a piano in the background. Good work.
Yes.
So you take the 12 notes of the chromatic scale, you put them in an order, and you must respect that order. You have to go through that sequence in its entirety before you ever repeat a note. So in the simplest case, if you're just imagine you're climbing up the chromatic scale, C, C sharp, D, D sharp, etc., you'd have to go all the way to the top, and then you cycle through it again. Typically, you wouldn't pick that predictable a pattern. I believe you're allowed to play notes simultaneously. So in our imaginary example, you could hit C, C sharp, and D at the same time, but you couldn't hit C, C sharp, D, and then A flat, because you hadn't gone through our whole ordering of the scale beforehand. You had to make your way up to that A flat in order to have the right to use it. So this is a very, I should probably cut myself short before the rest of our audience falls asleep, but The TLDR is you've got this very, very regimented way of composing. And the irony is it tends to sound random or disorganized to someone who doesn't really have a trained ear. The most, what we would call algorithmic or generative musical style, the most rule-based style, sounds like it has no rules at all, and it can sound like a cat walking across the piano. So that was the main contribution of Schoenberg around the early 20s, I believe, and that really set the stage for a number of atonal and serialistic composers who were to follow and really dominate at least the academic music scene for probably 50 or 60 years.
Yeah, that's a great description. I think the key word there, right at the very beginning of your description, which is very important, I think the key word is systematic, because if you're not that familiar with early 20th century music and experimental music, you may just listen to it and think, well, it just sounds like somebody bashing away on a keyboard, or those guys are just playing any random note that they want. Or it could actually sound like that if you weren't sure what you were listening to. But I think the key point is that there is a very, very strict system applied to how these pieces come together. 12-tone. When I was in high school, I went to a special interest music high school, and part of my graduation thing was doing a 12-tone piece. It was marvelously freeing. It's very strange that you would think that such a rigid system, even more rigid than sort of standard diatonic harmony, really, in that you have to follow in the notes in this order. You would think that that would be just basically more constrictive. It is constrictive, but I think for me, it removes the necessity to have to even think about that. And so you just follow note by note, and you can hone purely into instrumentation and texture, because you don't have to think about harmony or what you're going to do next. You know what you're going to do next is written on the page for you. So I remember when I did a few pieces in 12-tone, it was so liberating. It was, wow, this is great. I can just put all my energy into thinking about how I want it to sound, not the harmony and the progression and the movement and all of that kind of thing. Have you guys ever done any 12-tone work?
Go ahead.
I did a little bit. 12-tone is sort of a very specific type of serialism, and you can have serialism be total serialism, because you can apply serialism to other aspects of the music.
Vince, you probably should just define what you mean by serialism.
Yeah, so after Schoenberg, you did have other aspects. Schoenberg was very much about the 12-tone system, dodecaphonic music, and it was all about the pitches, just the pitch values. But then there are other values that we deal with music. So rhythm, for example, and texture, and dynamics, and you can apply serialism to all of that. And it's worth pointing out that there is, when it comes to atonal music, and Webern and Berg and everyone else that came after Schoenberg, there were still a lot of people that were 12-tone serialists. And then you also had the total serialists, and they have actually kind of a different sound to them. But again, that methodology is there, that system is there for how you construct music. And I did have a lot of fun actually playing around with serialism, and I thought it was actually very interesting when I was playing around with it in graduate school, doing things in Max MSP and other ways of computationally creating music compositions. Because, I've got these values, okay, I've got my tone row here, and I'm going to invert it. I'm going to retrograde invert it. And, that's just some math, flipping arrays and Max MSP, and I can do all this cool stuff. It is remarkably freeing, like you said, but it also feels a little bit weird in the context of writing music, not for music's sake, but writing music that's supposed to accompany something else. And for me, that would be video games. And I would find myself not really having difficulty writing the music, but having difficulty listening to the music and thinking, does this really fit what I'm trying to say here? I can think that the system that I've got here, or I've constructed this 7-note tone row. I think that this can work if I apply it to this particular aspect of this video game. But I listen to it and it doesn't feel right. It could be just great music. It could sound fine, but it doesn't feel right in the context of a video game.
I wonder why that is. Is that because, by its own nature, we're just because of for most people how we are raised and the musical context that we grow up in generally for most people, atonalism of any kind is going to require a little bit more concentration to listen to than regular harmonic diatonic harmony, because it's just unusual. So does that mean that it's actually pulling too much attention away from the video game, and it's not serving its role too well as an accompaniment to it? What do you think?
I think that we are... Oh, please go ahead.
You go ahead.
We're out nicing each other. I guess it's hard to remove the experience from listening to true 12-tone, atonal, serialistic music from the kind of musical orientation most of us have, which is we're steeped in tonal, or in the case of pop music, kind of modal music that is in some way grounded by a home base musically. There's always a one chord, whether there exists a 5-chord or not. We tend to think of there being a harmonic center, and a lot of contemporary film music, you might hear a very long drone just on one pitch. So we're very grounded. And when you get to the Schoenbergian tradition of trying to avoid that, it sounds chaotic and it can sound disturbing. And although there are some composers or fans of avant-garde music who can listen to like the pieces for orchestra or some of the most hardcore 12-tone serialistic music and say, well, this makes me feel like I'm relaxing on the beach with beautiful sunlight streaming through my hair, usually you're going to think this sounds like my house is on fire and a meteor is smashing through my ceiling, and my beloved is being kidnapped. Terrible things are happening. So where I think in practical terms the Schoenbergian version of atonality comes in handy is when you are deliberately trying to summon up emotions of chaos, or feeling disturbed or freaked out or terrified, as you might hear in suspense thrillers, survival horror games, or their film equivalent. I think the Schoenberg approach can be very useful if you're doing a very disaffecting horror score or thriller score, something like that. And that's when I found it most useful.
It's interesting. Completely lost what I was going to say. Thanks. Maybe it's this. Maybe it's this thing.
Well,
something is interesting.
Let's see. I'm going to go back a little bit because you mentioned Salome, and Salome was Strauss, and he's very much he's not a post-tonal composer. He's very much a romantic. But like you said, Salome did some really interesting things, and the tonality would shift often. It was still very singable. It was very beautiful in places, but the tonality would shift. And in Salome, towards the end of the piece, there's this wonderful chord that goes into that most people would analyze and say, well, it's polytonal. You've got this big old A major chord happening, while you also have this big old F sharp major chord that's happening in the brass. And it's, if you have those things together, you got an A major 7 chord and this F sharp major chord. You got those things together. Let's see.
Can't hear it, Vince. Are you playing? Can't hear it.
I am playing. Ooh, let me try this again. Sorry. I'll do this one more time. Master. Go here. So, Sonar, you can do this. Believe in yourself. It really, my Sonar doesn't want to be polytonal on me. Come on. Okay, let's do this.
There we go. That's good.
We got our A major 7 chord, and then we've got our F sharp major chord here. And those chords play together right before the very, very end of the opera. And it's it sounds all beautiful right before that. It's a let me see if I can bring up this chord. Actually, I've got it actually sitting
Yeah,
here.
according to the book here, Salome's debut caused violence in the audience because it was so like, what is this?
It's it's really quite crazy. It's I mean, now we listen to that thing and we think, oh, that's a weird sound. I don't think we would actually be prompted to be violent towards anyone. But
One really good example of where you can find uh, sort of slight inflections of atonal music used to very good effect is actually the Bugs Bunny show. Watch the Bugs Bunny show and listen to what the music is doing, because the Bugs Bunny show actually it's incredible. The music, the sound design for any kind of game that you're doing, learn from the Bugs Bunny show because it's fantastic. But the music, often you'll find that the music, I think, because the Bugs Bunny show, most of those were in the 50s. Is that right? Or the
Sounds about right.
yeah.
Yeah. So 1950, a lot of this stuff that we're talking about is only sort of 30 or 40 years old at that stage, and the music in the Bugs Bunny show is really cleverly taking influences from lots of stuff. You've got influences in there from Baroque styles, classical styles, romantic styles, and at the time, I guess the very progressive, the new stuff. The 20th century stuff that was coming out just 20 or 30 years before they were writing those scores for the Bugs Bunny show. But if you listen to how they add music to the movement, often they use it's often influenced by sort of atonal process. It's interesting because in part of reading this book, I was the book mentions Webern as a very good example of this, because one thing that Webern does is he was very interested in efficiency of composition, and so he developed his own style, at least according to the book, where at one stage with his pieces he was trying to be as efficient as possible. So very, very little is actually going on, and the pieces are quite short. And when you listen to Webern, it's really good because it actually gives you a chance to. It moves much more slowly, so it gives you a chance to appreciate and to really sort of interpret what you're listening to, much more say than Schoenberg and I haven't listened to much Berg, so I don't know, but which is more sort of full on. Webern stuff is a little bit more patient with you. When you listen to that, it's interesting. You listen, oh, that sounds just like the Bugs Bunny show. It sounds like Sylvester is stalking Tweety Bird, as Tweety Bird's like climbing up a tree or something. The kind of the way that they used it in the Bugs Bunny show is really, really clever. So definitely check that out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, with the Bugs Bunny stuff, all those Looney Tunes things. I mean, Carl Stalling was the composer for all that, and at the rates that they were churning out cartoons, he needed to write a whole lot of music for that. And efficiency and having a system is such an important part of it's inherent to a lot of post-tonality, so it makes sense that you would borrow and utilize these systems in order to flesh out all these spaces, and then with that efficiency comes really these direct connections that you have between the action that's happening on the screen and the things that are happening in the musical space. So it's pretty great.
So let's pull the discussion back to game audio for a moment. Can you guys think of any? So obviously there's the obvious applications with atonal music, with horror scores and scores that are specifically designed to make you feel uncomfortable at certain points during gameplay. Can you guys think of any example of, or anybody in the chat room, of games that use atonal style of music for something other than trying to make you feel uncomfortable or trying to make you scared? Of course, we need to draw the line there between atonal harmony and noise. This is now the discussion's going to get really heavy. Because, of course, sound design, you could say, well, that's kind of atonal, but of course that's quite a different area now, because now we're talking about noise and the sculpting of sound, as opposed to the intentional, systematic breakage of traditional harmonic rules, which is what we're discussing at the moment. So can you guys think of any examples where game music scores have used atonal music for something other than just intentionally making you feel uncomfortable? For example, maybe something quite beautiful, or sad, or can you think of anything?
I'm hard-pressed to come up with an example if we're thinking of the very specific narrow sense of atonality that we're discussing now, the kind of Schoenberg and Friends school of really trying to avoid a sense of tonal center. If we go to the general sense of atonality, I think most game music we hear today may technically qualify. Anything modal or anything intensely chromatic would technically be atonality. But other than survival horror games and their ilk, when it comes to using all 12 tones, I'm at a loss. There may be some subtle examples where someone has picked a tone row that feels tonal and that they're tapping into the methodology of serialism without sounding like serialism. But if there's some cases like that, they've flown under my radar.
You think Matt Miller is asking a fantastic question in the chat room right now, Mike. He says, would some early chip audio be considered atonal? So thinking of some of the chromatic runs and that sort of thing that was in very early chiptune soundtracks for games.
Well, I think when we're talking about atonality, we're usually mean in this narrow sense, getting away from the sense of being in a key. So a temporary area where the key or the chord is ambiguous doesn't really sound to us like atonal music. We really need a very prolonged exposure, this kind of free-floating sense of what key am I in? It sounds kind of like I could be anywhere and I don't know where I'm going. That's when it gets into the real atonal mood. And again, I think we can find examples of that in survival horror and other really intentionally disturbing examples. But I will say that if you change the focus a little bit and think of serialism that is not 12-tone, you find a world of other opportunities to avoid that kind of emotional sense of, I'm going to stab you in the head. If for example, if you take just the white notes of the piano, your diatonic scale, and say, I'm going to apply serialism to that subset of the possibilities, you can get very consonant sounding music that gets to experiment with those algorithms. And I think we're more likely in game audio to find examples of that, though it may be so subtle that we don't realize that those techniques have been used. Like I know in outside of game music, does anyone remember I think it was NBC News theme that John Williams wrote?
No.
Sure, yeah.
You remember that? That was a terrible. I believe that is a diatonic tone row. I believe he cycles through the notes of the major scale without repeating them.
He does.
In sequence, yeah.
That thing.
Yeah.
That was written by John Williams? I didn't know.
It was. It's one of his unsung achievements. But that right there is an example of diatonic serialism, which used a more narrow but more accessible musical vocabulary while still tapping into Schoenberg's techniques. So you can play around with those tools, and if you're willing to narrow the field a little bit and not try to grit your teeth and never sound like you're hitting a one chord, there are a lot of interesting results you can get.
Vince, when you're working on soundtracks, how much are you thinking about harmony and thinking about sort of coming back to a center? Obviously it's an intentional tool that you may use to give people, a certain feeling at certain points during the music. But do you ever have the opportunity or the curiosity or the energy to sort of, throw things out a little bit as far as harmony is concerned?
Well, and it does take a lot of energy for me, it feels like it does take a lot of energy to actually establish some sort of tonal center. I actually don't think very willy-nilly about what it is that I'm actually writing, even if it is very much in a very neoclassical or neo-romantic tradition. It's like, okay, am I actually doing this right? Am I doing this properly? So, going post-tonal from that, I'll have to be sitting with something for a really long time before I actually consider that as a possibility. Um, Usually, I'm not really thinking about serial techniques. I'm actually, if anything, if I'm going to be moving away from the neoclassical, neo-romantic tradition, I'm I'm looking at the other 20th century stuff. So I'm looking at things like Philip Glass and John Adams and the minimalist guys,
Hmm.
uh, which are which is very different and somehow surprisingly accessible and prevalent everywhere. You know, you're asking about serialism examples in video games. Oh, man, I really can't think about that. But minimalism in video games. Man, it seems like almost everything is minimalist these days. You know, your AAA blockbusters, okay, yeah, Halo, yeah, Call of Duty, yeah, there's some minimalist stuff happening there. You know, there's a whole lot of that.
Hmm.
John Williams isn't even very much a minimalist composer, but I definitely heard a whole lot of cues in The Force Awakens, which is like, okay, this sounds kind of minimalist over here now for this action cue. Okay, that's different.
It's really interesting that the progression through the 20th century and how our ears, because of various influences, how we're much more desensitized to this kind of thing than we used to be, especially minimalism. And I don't know why. Like for myself, um, yeah, growing up with all those classic Commodore Amiga games and stuff where the music is a loop that just goes over and over again. It's not really minimal in the sense that, I guess it depends how you define minimalism, but I've always understood and thought minimalism needs to have at least some kind of movement and progression, even though it may be incredibly slow. Um,
Mm-hmm.
Whereas, of course, in this case, it's a technical limitation. You've just got a loop that's going on. But going from that into my first love in music, which was actually very minimal industrial German techno, which is precisely minimalism in that you listen, you'll only notice it's like a clock. You don't, if you look at a clock, you'll never see the hand moving. But if you sort of listen here and then just kind of zone out for a bit and then kind of look back again, the hand has moved. So it's the same with this kind of music that you focus on the music, what's it doing right now, and you listen to the layers, and okay, that's what it's doing, and then you may just kind of space out for a bit and go off on some mind-bending journey to planet Mars or whatever, and come back. Oh wow, the music's completely different now, and I didn't notice it changing, even though I've been sitting here listening to this or dancing or whatever for like 5 minutes now, or 10 minutes, or 20 minutes, or 1-2 hours. Minimalism, it's really weird. Like I think that our generation, for whatever reason, we're far more desensitized to repetitive music than previous generations, and I don't know why that is. Because, like my father, who I mentioned, is a classical musician of some experience. He can't stand this kind of repetitious music. He said, "This, how can you even stand that? It like drives you nuts. Just the same thing going over and over again." And I'm saying, no, but listen, because it's going over and over again, you have a chance to sort of let your ears work its way in between the different layers of sound, and you can hear that here, and you hear this here, and listen to that, and and before you know it, it's changed, but you didn't notice it changing, and isn't that cool? And you'd be like, no, it's just the same thing over and over. It's like listening to a washing machine. Yeah, washing machine, cool.
A
So
washing
you're
machine.
the washing machine.
I always
The washing
describe
machine. Okay.
that first love of industrial German music. I always describe it as a washing machine with a drum beat and like a microphone held up to a frog. And that's basically it. Anyway, why do you think it is that this is kind of stretching on from our discussion about atonal harmony, or atonal inharmony? But why do you think it is that our generation and generations progressively we're seeing that are far less sensitive to atonal music and minimalist music than previously? Well, what happened?
Do you think we're less sensitive to atonal music? Like we're more accepting of it?
I would say that I would argue that yes, that if you take like the average young person, and you sit them down in front of something like you sit them down in front of a game soundtrack, which is like a horror soundtrack, which is intentionally designed to make them feel uncomfortable, and it's all, stretching ideas of traditional harmony here and there. It takes from like 50 years ago, the same young person, and I think you may get a different response. I don't know.
I think given that you're talking about music in context of games where it's accompaniment and we're not just sitting in our comfy chair putting on headphones and listening to Schoenberg's Five Pieces for Orchestra or something like that, unless it was six. I don't know that we're that accepting of atonality except in the very specific context of accompaniment. But I think you'd have to search long and hard to find somebody outside of academia who is really interested in atonal music as an end in itself. I think it's a refined taste that's probably less prevalent today than it might have been before.
Okay, maybe you're probably right if we're just looking at, as you said, that slither of definition of what atonal music is. It's interesting that when you listen to stuff like, I don't know if you guys ever listen to stuff like, the stuff the young kids listen to, like the American dubstep, which is way different from the original, UK dubstep, but that kind of stuff, yeah, it's not atonal, because it usually does have a tonic center that it always comes back to. It's so noisy, and it's so, in terms of the kind of palette of sound that's going on there, it's a lot of noise, and it's very interesting. It's kind of like achieving that sense of excitement that you would get from dance music, using purely sound design, as opposed to using musical content. That kind of thing. I'm not personally a big fan of the sort of American style big. I think that the technical term is bro step. I'm not a huge fan of it, but when I listen to it, I think it's really interesting that and the same goes for if you go away from electronic music and you look into sort of metal music and a lot of the sort of punk, trash, grime kind of very noisy kind of stuff. Again, myself, I find it. I'd need to hear from somebody who likes that music a lot what it is that they like about it in order for myself to learn how to interpret it properly. But to me, it appears to be very, very progressive from a musical point of view. So yeah, I would say that okay, yeah, you're right. Maybe not the narrow definition of atonalism, that people are more accepting of that. But I think that generations as they come are more accepting of more, let's say, abstract.
Well, I think that I'm not trying to put words in your mouth, but I think maybe what you're getting at is that we meaning kind of anyone born after the Beatles, really, or who's matured relative to the first half of the 20th century, we've become more accepting of rhythmically driven music that can be very drone-based. And we can focus more on rhythm and even accept a lot of musical decoration that's very dissonant, a lot of distortion and amplifiers and effects, and really raunchy sounds as long as we feel like there's a coherent beat. And I would argue that there's got to be some sense of a drone, like of a one chord or an implied tonal center for people to really click into it. Or some kind of substitute. I guess certain forms of hip hop are completely musicless, but more typically you're going to have some kind of groove. You're going to be hitting the one chord or the tonal home center over and over and over again. And I think our acclimatization to that in pop music and film music and in game music is definitely a recent phenomenon on the grand scale of musical history. And everyone's dad probably rolls their eyes at what we consider to be really interesting music, even though it may be not very chromatic, it may not be very harmonically diverse or sophisticated.
Okay, so I wonder why that is then. What has fueled this change?
There's a lot of money to be made in figuring out that answer.
Wow. I feel like, and I wish I was better about this, but I kind of want to say that I wonder if there's some sort of weird connection between sort of the development of mainstream music, hip hop, pop music, the mainstream music, and then the academic music of the post-tonal world that you've described, of Schoenberg and Berg, and the disparate nature of I want to say this, just continental philosophy versus analytic philosophy. Um, and the an analytic philosophy is very much well, it's not continental philosophy. It's very much comes from the English speakers, so U.S., U.K., Bertrand Russell, those guys, um, having really argumentative clarity. Uh, all that stuff that happened in the early 20th century, both musically and philosophically, I think was really sort of trying to just touch on the meta philosophy, the larger concept, and see what can be done there because there's so much space that you aren't necessarily comfortable with, but you don't have to be comfortable with because you can be comfortable in process, in method, and system.
Hmm.
You don't need that clarity. But the world of the 21st century is a world of clarity for all the stuff that is out there that we clearly don't know because now true knowledge is replaced by Google. We actually have things that we want to have strong anchor points on. We have those one chords, that we have that strong tonal center. We don't really care about the meta existence of the music that we listen to.
Hmm. I think
Um,
I think certainly also one important thing that has fueled the change is the tools that we have available for doing the work that we do. I think with the easy access to tools that can produce and reproduce, more importantly, produce and reproduce crazy sounds, specifically sampling and of course synthesis technology and those, and then the sort of the general sort of proliferation of these sort of devices into people's hands that can do some crazy things with reproducing sound. Anybody can make crazy sounds, but the ability to actually easily reproduce it so that people can listen to it, other people can listen to it after the moment that you've created it, and then you can apply it to things like movies and other kinds of experiences, and of course games, specifically games in our case. I think that has also had a huge part to play in the sort of shifting of what people feel is comfortable and uncomfortable is from a musical point of view. Well, I think as we get to the end of the episode, I think end of the show, it'd be good if we could sort of bring it back into to game music, especially for people watching. If you are writing some music for a game or designing some sound for a game, what can we learn from the 20th century, Michael?
Well, there are two things we can steal usefully. One is the idea of playing with rules in composition. You don't have to go whole hog, avoid any sensible one chord the way Schoenberg did, but you can borrow the idea of serialism and say, suppose I'm going to make a melody that does take 5 pitches or 7 pitches or 9 and specifies them in some way other than improvisation. I'm going to start with this interval, I'll start with a fifth, and I'm going to stack a bunch of fifths, just adding some degree of systematicity to what you do. As both you, Alex, and you, Vince, have said, it can actually be weirdly freeing. You may say, now I'm going to focus on harmony because I've kind of got my melody baked into the system, or I'm going to really focus on rhythm just using these 5 notes or these 3 notes. And it's amazing what you can come up with that may divert from your normal habits of just improvising at the keyboard or even improvising internally. Mm. And I think where minimalism is concerned, we didn't quite go into this the same way, you might say, let me start with some kind of groove or some sort of texture, pick one parameter of that texture, and very slowly change it over time. And again, the difference from improvisation is you kind of pick what that is. Like, and now I'm going to make it an eighth and 2/16ths, and now I'm going to make it 2/16ths and 2/8ths, etc. Some little sliver of systematicity amidst your usual improvisation can be a very useful tool. And I think if we steal the idea of ordering pitches or ordering rhythm from the serialists, or we steal the idea of keeping everything really, really simple and repetitive, but varying one parameter very systematically from the minimalists, we might find we're really expanding our palette for game music in a very interesting and novel way.
And not only game music as well. I think everything that you just said can also be applied, modified, of course, to sound design. If you are making sounds for games as well, I think constructing a system where you limit yourself to, for example, only using certain kinds of physical items to create sounds, or a certain, I don't know, certain microphone, or in my case, I like to synthesize sounds, so a certain synthesizer only to do sounds, or a certain effects plugin, or something like that. And finding a systematic way to do things and still achieve the same end result as far as the effect that you're trying to create for the player of the game. I think that can be really useful as well. And it's easy when you go back to the real sort of retro 8-bit games and what they had to do with their extremely limited sound palette, and yet when you play those games, because it's all part of one, it's forced into a consistent direction simply because of the limitations of the hardware. It doesn't seem out of place at all. Of course a jump sounds like that, and of course it sounds like that when you get hit by, a monster or whatever. Certainly that kind of systematic approach to limitation can be applied to sound design as well. Vince?
Yeah, I think that also when looking at games and game designs and genres, I think that there is definitely a place for both serialism in that Schoenberg, Webern sense, as well as minimalism, just by looking at what games can be comprised of. There are a lot of action games where the performance of the game is inherently a minimalist performance. Tapping the A button, tapping the B button, different sorts of ways of tapping the A and B button. There's really not too much difference between playing the first level of Call of Duty, Black Ops, and the last level of Call of Duty Black Ops. So, okay, minimalism can work there. And I started thinking about serialism. I don't know if you guys have played The Witness, which is Jonathan Blow's latest game, which is an epic game of puzzles. Lots and lots of puzzles. It also has no musical score. I thought, well, maybe it could have had a score. And puzzles, for what puzzles are, which are these really interesting constructs, abstract constructs that you're dealing with. And you're not so much efforting towards a solution as deciphering the code. And serialism could be a wonderful way to actually orally represent that world. And I think not just explicit abstract puzzles like The Witness and other puzzle games, but other games where there's a puzzle nature to it, deciphering codes in an adventure game, and these other sort of more grand designs of adventure gaming, which are less popular these days, but certainly a big part of the gaming tradition still. I think serialism would be a wonderful way to actually represent the things that are going on in that world. You're not just riffing on a puzzle in a minimalist way, like you would when in action in Mario or Call of Duty. You're finding this thing, and perhaps music that really matches the identity of the puzzle that you're dealing with, code you're deciphering, would be great.
Well, it's been a fairly meaty discussion today, guys. I'm actually kind of feeling a bit exhausted. I might go and just play a C major chord for a while.
So you're leaning towards minimalism then.
Oh, okay. And then a G7, just to kind of reset myself. All right. Well, thanks very much for joining me, and a quick shout out to our wonderful sponsor, iZotope, who make some of the most fantastic plugins for specifically what we were talking about today: sound mangling and perfecting your sound, polishing your sound. Go and check out the stuff. iZotope, great stuff. Also, don't forget that we're on Twitter at Game Audio Hour and Facebook. We have a Facebook page, Game Audio Hour, and also on YouTube. Please subscribe to us on YouTube if you enjoyed this, and we'll see you next week. If you weren't aware, we do actually have a live chat room, which is at gameaudiohour.com/live. So if you go there, you can actually participate in the show as we broadcast it, because that's how we roll. All right, guys, have a great week.
Likewise.
And we'll see you all next week. Bye.